The Express.
So this is chapter 3, Becoming True. Welcome back, everybody. We've been enjoying this series so far. We feel like this has helped us a lot in our walk of life. And last week we talked about becoming a son and what that relationship is like, being a son to our Heavenly Father, and how to mold ourselves to be everything that He's asked us to be. And this chapter really builds off of that chapter because this is all about becoming our true self, and it really breaks down the origin of how we lost our true selves in God through the story of Adam and Eve, and how we ultimately live a lot of our life in what he refers to as our false self, which can help us get by around people that don't necessarily know us as much, but it can tear down and hurt the people that are closest to us. So really intrigued to dive into this one and be really open and vulnerable to each other about what our false self looks like and how we can combat that through becoming our true self of who God has made us to be.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and say that if you're listening to this, this can be us three are going through it together. You're going through it with us in a way that you're listening to it, watching it, whatever it may be. But we invite you to, maybe if you have a best friend or even your father or whoever you feel like might want to listen to this, talk to them about it, see if they want to go through it with you. These episodes are coming out every other week, so you do have time to kind of add people on board or just catch up with them or whatever it may be for these current episodes. But as we're figuring out, these kind of chapters are building blocks to what we're ultimately trying to become, and they are tough to get through by yourself, especially when you're trying to be honest and vulnerable. And so if you've been listening, we thank you. We're being honest and vulnerable as possible. And yeah, so the first thing that I guess this chapter, as Dan was talking about, is called Becoming True. And it is, like he was saying, probably his favorite chapter. And it is one that is, you really got to look at yourself in the mirror, because it's not easy to get through, because you got to go through a lot of stuff to get through it. And so the first thing I said, or the first thing I wrote in my notes, it says, before we can change our situations outside with other people, we must first address the issues within ourselves, which is tough. So thoughts?
Yeah, I'll kind of feed off that. I have it written down right before that he kind of uses a metaphor of a crowded town, like in Atlanta or something, and symbolizes, especially us, kind of, we're at that age of 28 where we've kind of built up our self, our false self, our true self. We have a good idea of what both of those characters are. But in terms of the city, to build a new building, you can't build that building without tearing down a previous one. And I think that's pretty, symbolic of us trying to destroy this false self of our shortcomings that we do, the fake personas that we show to the world, but, on the inside, we're a completely different person. And then building up that new true self that, our best self that we're aiming to be.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Yeah, preach.
No, I think we are in a unique situation, like you said. We're all 27, 28. So we've built up a lot of our personality. Like, we know who we are. We're not in that search. If you're in high school and doing this book, or a little bit younger, you may not have fully discovered yourself yet. I know that process didn't really happen to me till I was about 24, 25-ish.
Out of college, for sure.
So, we do have a pretty good idea of the direction. At least we'd like to think we do.
Right.
But I challenge everyone to understand what it is that they either need to build up, if you do have the space to build something up if you are younger, but like we, being a little bit older, we kind of have to tear something down first before we, build up something else. And I think that, like you alluded to, Mitch, was such an awesome metaphor of how to become our true self, because in order to make something great, you have to tear down something first in order to build something up. So that's kind of like the premise of this whole chapter. He calls it excavating. How do you excavate something within you before you can build up what God our Father is trying to build us up. So
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of jump on the first little subcategory here. And so his first little subcategory, which I actually do enjoy how he breaks down this book into topics.
Right.
And so he talks about pain, which is, I wrote down in my notes that for pain, it says what we have to go through in realization of our true self, as these two gentlemen were just talking about. And it's tough, right? And so even though that I guess the problem is you have to acknowledge where let's keep going with that example, where your town or city needs to be built up. So you have to acknowledge the areas of improvement, which we've been talking about on the episodes before this. And then second, in order to get to where you want to go, there's going to be some construction. And it may not look pretty in certain parts of the construction. It may be a long process, but construction is happening, right? I mean, if you're in the Atlanta area, just like look at Windy Hill.
No,
One day, Windy Hill will be.
I doubt it.
I hope so, because it is a journey getting over here. I feel like I'm going through, I don't know, the jungle to get here.
Right.
But the construction part is going to take a long process within ourselves. And so when you discover something, whatever it is that you want to change, whether it's your relationship with God or whoever, it's going to be one of those things that you may not like the realization that you're having. And you can either figure that out, or it could be a situation where someone says, hey, you're acting like this, or you're being like, I don't know if you realize this, but you're being like this. And that can be easy for us to deflect and be like, no, that's not what it is. But when you truly break it down and you think about it, I mean, that could be a hard process to go through.
Oh, we were talking about this before Mitch got over here. Man, so many times in my relationship, it's so easy to pin something on the other person, like, well, I'm acting like this because you're acting like that. And I think that it's such a hard pill for us men to swallow, is our relationship, whether it's with our spouse or friends, how they are responding back to you, usually, if not 99.9% of the time, is a direct reflection on how you are either treating or responding to them in the first place. And I think that as men, we really need to take that accountability into like the highest of standards and regards, because if we're constantly aligned the right way, then those things that pop up aren't going to pop up, right? And that's the ideal. Now, I understand that that's not always the case, that we're not always going to be our best selves, but that is what we are striving for here, in this journey together on through this book and on this podcast, is how can we become aligned with the Father so much that all those little things are not coming about, and that we're staying truly aligned and have the confidence and validation from God our Father, instead of looking into other ways. And I feel like that's something that he points out to early on, is he caught himself in this lie of every bit of validation that he was trying to get was through other people. It was through his previous relationships before his wife. It was through his relationship with women, and it was in his leadership of people. So talks about how he was always class president, and he was searching for the validation of his life through other people and not God. And he essentially said that was killing him. And so I guess my question is, what are those things that are taking y'all away from becoming your best self? Like, where are you seeking validation from God? Or like, what are the other areas in which you're seeking that validation?
Your friends, your social media following. I think that's a big one, especially for literally everybody right now, especially the younger cats. Like, they've grown up with that. We didn't grow up with social media, so it's kind of like a newish thing for us. But like these kids that have had Instagram and been comparing themselves to other people since they were like 10 years old, like that is a huge thing, especially with us in society now, is like the constant comparisons, I feel like, and the validation from others of people that you don't even know. Like it's not your close people that you're searching validation from. It's people that you've never met. Right. Yeah. Which is a crazy concept to even like wrap your head around. It sounds crazy when you say it out loud, but it's happening every day.
Yeah. It's kind of like, I think just coming from a teacher world, I actually had a lecture about this. I teach a course, and it's a conversational course, and the first thing that I do is we talk about I call them power words. And so our first power word is identity, which is when I saw this in this chapter, I was like, like I could have used this
Yeah,
like 2 weeks ago. This would have been great. And I actually did use some. We did social hierarchy, so I incorporated his term of the use of power that we had talked about in a couple episodes, and told the kids all about the book or whatever. And they're like, "You read?" And I'm like, "Yeah."
I'm a lecturer.
That's what I do.
Yeah.
And so it is very interesting with kids because we talk about. So I start off my whole class with this identity purpose, and the reason why I do this is because I tell them the problem in society, and this leads perfectly into his next little subtopic. The problem in society is people spend too much time trying to get another person on their side of their argument or their view. And the problem is the reason that they're doing that, and the reason that it's always like anger, violence, or just not going well is because humans, adults, people do not understand other humans, adults, people. And so part of the problem is you can't change, like after, I forget what the stat is, but after a certain age, like a person is very unlikely to change, like their type of characteristics, their traits, stuff like that. Does it happen? Sure. But they're very unlikely because they've had everything like deep rooted into their brains since they were a kid. And so I say, the first thing we're going to do in my class is we're going to understand the type of people in this class, because I talk about subjects that may be considered hot topics or whatever like that. Because when you get in the real world, everyone always says, well, school does nothing for me. It's not realistic. I'm never going to calculate the angle between the tree and the pavement. Like, I don't care. And then you come into my class and I'm like, yeah, there's no test quizzes, nothing. Like, I'm going to evaluate you in different ways. And they're like, whoa. And so I tell them we're going to talk about things, but in order to understand why someone may feel a certain way that they do about a topic, you got to understand who they are. So a big part of our first unit is kind of understanding who people are and who they are as themselves. And I tell them this, I say, you need to be honest with yourself, because I make them do exercises and we write an I am poem and this whole thing. And I say, be honest with who you are as a person, because what happens is you lie to yourself and then you get upset at other people when they treat you like for who you really are, because they figure it out, and not who you are pretending to be. Because there's a lot of times like people put on this mask or this costume of who they want to be, and that's not who they are as a person.
Hence
right?
the false self.
Correct. And so, and that dives into stereotypes, all sorts of stuff, because you can have kids in high school who may dress a certain type of way. They may be known as bad kids, or may be known as people who are selling drugs or whatever and doing what they're supposed to be doing. But then when you get to know that kid, you understand that they have a tough family life. Their father passed away when they were young. Their mother scrapes the table for food. Like, you start to understand them, and then you start going, now I understand why you act and do. And they may be searching for other things, but
Because that leads into something that I wrote down too. And it's simple as that false self that they are portraying gives them what he calls as false nourishment. Because it validates them in ways that their false self wants to be validated, as opposed to who they truly are. And I think that that's something that, we all battle with a lot. And, I go back to the validation thing. I feel like he brings up a point of we need to become really aware. Awareness, self-awareness is one of the biggest, I think, character traits that we can all have is which self is active. Is it our false self that's active, or is it our true self that's active? And I feel like for me, I start to know when I'm not necessarily my true self is when I really start to dive into wanting to be liked by all those around me, whether it's saying the things that should be said so that people like me, as opposed to maybe saying or doing things that I know is right. Whether it's leadership on a team, whether it's leadership in my relationship, I start to seek approval of all those around me instead of, seeking, what God has in store for me. And I feel like that happens a lot, in my relationship and with Mallory and with friends and family, is instead of seeking their approval and trying to do things that are going to get them to like give me a pat on the back or for them to like me, if I'm just my true self, they do like me. You know what I mean? And it's the confidence to just be who God made me to be, and that's more than enough, because that's who Mallory fell in love with in the first place, and that's who, my family raised me to be, and it's what the people closest to me appreciate the most, and not me trying to manufacture or walk on eggshells to be perfect so that I can be liked all the time. It's more about becoming who God made me to be, so that all of that flows naturally.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the whole design of I mean, I don't know if you could pinpoint a design that really took ATL off, but like be your best self in that shirt. Like
That was like our OG, really. Like,
that's really the shirt that I would say like catapults it, and then you get into the good energy stuff. But I will say this too with, you know, just you, Dansby. It is amazing to me how you have been able to stay true to yourself despite all the fame and everything that you have gotten.
Thanks, bro.
Like, I'm not patting your back, but people always ask me, you know, well, what's he like? Is he different or is he this? You're
that's what I'm saying.
the same Dansby as when we were 6 years old playing softball, trying not to get in trouble by Nancy.
Right.
Like, we're,
That's the truth.
Well, then that's like people, you know, what's he like? I'm like, he's a normal dude. Like, he's like, you've met all my other friends. He's just like all my other friends. That's why we're in this family and unit together, is because we're all like-minded and enjoy each other's company.
yeah. And so when you talk about your ability to become the true self, and so what I wrote for understanding people, it says operating in the true self or false self, meaning you must address the false self in order to get back to what is true. And then I'm going to read a little bit of what he wrote on page 44, just to kind of
44.
I'm sorry, 34.
I was about to say, Lord.
We're on chapter 5 already.
34. So the author wrote, the more I become aware of how the image of God is being expressed in these two ways, the more I can address the false and operate as the unique man God meant me to be. Not only to decrease the harm in my intentions, which says in my false self brings to myself and others, but also to bring a measure of joy and strength in my true self to those that I love.
Mm-hmm. And to give a little bit of clarity, he talks about how his intensity as a person, when it's used as his false self, harms people in the wrong way. But when he uses his intensity as joy and strength, it really brings love to the people closest around him. And I feel like that my dad would always say this. He would say, don't let your biggest strengths become your biggest weaknesses. And to me, what he was really saying is, don't let who God made you to be, don't let those strengths of the gifts that he gave you, don't have that basically become a weakness of, you know, whether it's for me, it's like overthinking. Like, God made me to be a pretty smart guy, and don't allow those smarts to take you away and start to overthink things and get to the paralysis by analysis. Don't allow for those gifts that you've been given to take away from all that's in store for you.
Yeah.
I was listening to Ed Milet podcast. Shout out Ed Milet. It's a good podcast, so listen to it. But
After you listen to ours.
right, this is the plug for that. But it's been a year or so since I listened to this one episode, and it still resonates with me because it was a pretty powerful message. It's actually, we'll put the author, he was interviewing this author of a book called Best Self, actually. And he talks about this exercise, and I did it way back when, probably need to revisit it, but he discusses, you know, when you are your best self, what are your attributes? You know, whether it's funny, you know, not judgmental, open, you know, whatever it is, make your list of all the good stuff you are when you're being your best self. And in the exercise, he makes you draw out a picture or whatever and put a name to it. And in Ed Milet's case, it was, you know, Superman was his best self. When he was his best self, he felt like Superman, right? And then, you know, on the contrary, it's okay, when you are your false self or you're not being your best self, what do those attributes look like? Whether it's now you're judgmental, you know, now you're overthinking, now you're gossiping, right? And then draw a picture of that guy and give him a name as well, so you can have an idea and a face to what that false self looks like. In Ed Milet's example, his false self was Richard Cabeza, which there's a short name for Richard. It's a genitalia part, and Cabeza is Spanish for head, if that tells you like kind of his thought process there. But I come back to this because, you know, when I'm sitting on the couch and watching TV or something, and I know there's laundry to be done or the dogs need to be let out, and I'm just like, you know, I'm too tired. It's like, what would my Superman do right now? It's like, get up, fold the laundry because you know it's the right thing to do, right? That's my best self attributes, is getting the job done. So I find myself constantly like kind of like going back to that, probably not as much as I should, but and then on the other side, it's like when I do something irrational or reactionary, it's like, okay, that's my Richard Cabeza, right? Like, that's not who I want to be. So, but then that way you can identify the attributes for each, and when you're being each person,
which
right?
heightens your awareness. So
Right.
what we're asking you to do is do an exercise like that, to be able to put a name and a face to you at your best and you not necessarily at your best. And this next part, I love how we're just going through like each of the little subtopics he
I'm
puts in
telling
the
you,
book.
he does a great job of doing that.
And I'm just going to read it to y'all. It may be a little lengthy, but I think it's really, this will be my fourth time now reading it. And it just is, it's so powerful. And he's, to give you a little backdrop,
35.
Yeah, page 35. He's talking about Adam and Eve and just the story of creation and how we basically got to this point of the fall of man, essentially. And he says, before the fall, Adam enjoyed and rested in love and validation. He had self-esteem and self-worth that sustained and strengthened him for the meaningful work the Father was training him to do. In union with God, he and Eve knew they were everything they needed to be to partner with God and contribute creatively to his creation. They had everything they needed to rule and subdue, as well as cherish and steward creation. Adam knew, I have what it takes. Eve knew, I am a life giver. They were united as one with God. Nothing was impossible. And just to stop there before I continue, all of this is just, it hits home with me, because when I'm my best self, I'm very convicted in what I believe and convicted in what I do. And I move throughout my day very much as myself, clear on what's ahead, clear on what to do. There's no second guessing. There's no overthinking. I am just me. And then it says, after the fall, identity was called into question, which we all do, and start to think, well, when I'm not my best self, I question everything. Right. I am unclear. I am in muddy waters. And it says, Adam began an incessant search to answer the questions, to answer the question, who am I? Shame rolled in like the tide. Anxiety was born, and the reaching to fill the ache of masculine soul apart from God began. It began as a reach for a fig leaf to cover all that was exposed and vulnerable, which we do when we don't feel like we're our best selves. We search, we hide.
The mask.
Yeah, the mask comes on, the false self comes out. And it says, for the first time, man had no rest in knowing he was the beloved son, God's favorite. I am was replaced with I'm not. And it says, basically, like your identity was then substituted with shame. And hiding was the only way to respond to that anxiety. And then the last part says, through the fall, validation was called into question. Fear spread like a heavy fog, which, once again, when we're not our best selves, we're scared that we're going to rub our partner the wrong way. We're scared to mess up. We don't want to be our true selves because we don't have confidence in that person. And it says, I can was replaced with I can't. For the first time in human history, Adam doubted his strength. For the first time, Eve doubted her capacity to bring forth life and beauty. And thus began our desperate search for love in the form of validation and identity apart from God. Wholehearted authenticity, courage, love, vulnerability, intimacy all evaporated. Shame grew, anxiety filled the air, hearts were unsettled, and both Adam and Eve turned to the false self to deliver them. And it's just so powerful, because I just think about all the times when I'm not me, right? When I'm not Dansby, I'm not funny, I'm not goofy, I'm not, just convicted in what I believe in. All these things come into play. My anxiety goes through the roof. I start walking on eggshells because I'm scared. I'm fearful of what that's going to bring, instead of going back to what I'm rooted in as who God created me to be. And I know I'm getting a little long-winded here, but I read that to Mallory the other day. I've read it over and over again. I've read it to Macen before the podcast, and I'm reading it now because that, I think, understanding the story of how these things came about in our world, just from the one simple thing of Eve eating the fruit and then Adam choosing to also choose Eve over God, essentially has led to these problems that we now face. And I think it's important to understand that so that you can understand yourself more, because, man, it just hits home when he says, like, Adam for the first time doubted his strength, and he all of a sudden realized, like, he's vulnerable and naked, and he doesn't know which way to turn because he's looking for validation from everything else but who created him.
There is a lot to unravel in that little story. Like, it's just so crazy to me, just the stories behind Adam and Eve, and like how much you can take away from that little story. And the fact that, like what you were talking about, when Adam chooses Eve over God, and then Eve obviously disobeys. I wrote down, like, this stems from the fact that, and he talks about this, every human needs love to be loved, and to move closer and closer to the source of love. And so when Adam and Eve, before they disobey God, they have no concept that they're even naked because they're their true selves. Like they're not even acknowledging the other person that they're naked. Like they're just living their true selves. And that's interesting because when we live our true selves, we don't think about all the little stuff because we're just being who we are. It's like we don't like, that's like people always talk about our friend group. Is like we are all very comfortable with each other and who we are as people. And so we don't consider like the little stuff. Like, that's weird. Y'all do like what? It's like, no, like we're just true. Like there's no judgment zone when you're with us in our friend group. And so when they disobey, they all of a sudden like become aware that they are naked. And that's why I'm pretty sure God goes to them and he asks them like, why are they covered? And they're like, well, because we're naked. He's like, how do you know you're naked? Boom. And so it's like when you disobey, and so now they're living within their false self. And I like Dansby and I before the podcast were talking about the I am statements. And I talked to him about the book of John and the 7 I am statements. And that phrase, and Dan, you can jump into it a little bit because what you were saying before was really good. But the phrase, like there is something to be said for the phrase I am. Like it is very powerful. So if you don't know the power of the phrase I am, like I am is what, essentially like God would say, like he would say I am because he is everything. And then the problem sort of erupted when people were not believing that Jesus was who he was claiming was because Jesus was saying that. He was saying I am. Yep. And so they were looking at him and they were going, it's impossible. Yeah. You cannot be because you are not God. And then that gets like whole full circle of Father, Son,
Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think kind of because, I mean, for those of you that don't know, like we said, the I am, when God would always refer to himself as I am.
Right.
And so when Jesus, like you said, was getting into trouble with what people were thinking about him is because he was using the statement, I am. And they didn't like that because they didn't believe who he said he was to be. And that's why I think that there is so much power behind the words I am. And as long as we are using it in the right way, along the right guidelines of I am convicted, that's my word, is I am convicted because I am convicted in who God made me to be, right? Like the I am statement's powerful because I'm using it in the terms of who God's made me to be. And I know that, we as a society have gotten into the whole, like, basically if you write down I am this and that and this and that, and you're essentially manifesting yourself who you want to be, we've kind of replaced the manifest, we've replaced manifest, or people have replaced prayer with manifest and replaced God with universe. And it's saying that they're kind of using the I am statement in the wrong ways to gain validation of this world as opposed to validation from, God the Father. So the next little topic is about the false self. And I know we've mentioned that on some of the previous podcasts, and we'll dive into it a little bit more, but he kind of breaks it down into the false self is a couple different things. And number one, it's habitual. And then number 2 and 3 is the false self is self-referencing and self-stabilizing. And that the false self really doesn't get us anywhere. So, I find myself in this all the time because I start to, now that he broke this down of the false self is habitual, I'm like, oh my gosh, when we become reactionary, like Mitch has alluded to before, we're being our false self because we're reacting in a way that's pre-programmed in our minds to react to a type of situation, with, how we've been shaped throughout our lives to react a certain type of way instead of each time taking it for what it is and, handling a situation based on how God would guide us to handle that situation. And I thought that was pretty interesting because he even goes into just different times when, like that's kind of like the enemy trying to speak through us when we start, answering in pre-programmed ways of how the culture sees things or, I feel like it's just like the enemy's way of getting between, our relationship and our sonship with God.
Well, I wrote down the false self is constructed mostly to avoid shame and fear, right? And that's what kind of you program yourself to say you get caught in a lie. It's like, well, I'm going to lie because I don't want to feel shame for being caught in this lie, right? Like,
or shame for what I did.
Right, correct. Yeah,
Well, you're being forced to be held accountable to your actions, which people don't like that all the time.
well, it's when they're not being the best selves, right? Like if you're constantly trying to be your best self, you don't necessarily aim to run into these sort of problems. But when you're doing the things that, you know, your false self, the pre-programmed stuff, the reactionary stuff, that's when you kind of get caught up in this shameful and fearful sense of being.
Just like the realizing that you're naked.
Correct.
Yeah. Now I got a question, and I just thought about this. Do you think, because we do live in a period of social media or whatever, do you think the reason that the people act the way that they do on social media towards like athletes and stuff, you know how they're almost like preying, like LeBron, how people are preying on his downfall? Like, you know, we always talk about when he lost that championship, like some people celebrated because he lost. Do you think people are haters or whatever, try to prey on somebody's downfall because they're not their true
It's
self?
internal, yeah.
Every lashing out is some form of their false self. I think Gary Vee, one thing that he always said was like, nobody's comments bother me because I know that what they're saying isn't them, right? And I feel like even too, to some extent, like in a relationship, when you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, it's not like a cop out of like, well, that's not me. It's one of those things of, okay, if that's not you, you need to get back into the form of your true self. And what we talked about earlier, of the awareness of knowing which is which and how to be more active in the true self form.
Well, I wrote this down, and it's later in the chapter, but it's relevant to this question. It says, how we relate with others, especially the ones close to us, is an indicator of our spiritual maturity. It's like you see those cats lashing out on Instagram and stuff. It's like something's not right in their own house, you know?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to know, too, when people lash out at you, that it's important to keep grace and humility in the whole thing, because you need to understand and have the spiritual maturity to be able to say, that is not who they are, right? And how can, you know, and it's not an excuse that you can just continue to be that person. That's your challenge to, you know, excavate, tear down that building and build what should be up. But I feel like it's really important to understand that, you know, in those moments when you are acting a certain way, to be able to self-correct and get back into alignment with, you know, God the Father.
That's interesting. It's almost, yeah, because when people act a certain way towards you or us or whatever on social media, which I don't really get negative, but like,
I do.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, obviously, you're a professional athlete, and then like Mitchell runs a clothing line, so people are always going to find stuff to pick at. But it's just interesting to say that when people have a certain reaction towards you, of having that spiritual awareness that, hey, you know what? There may be either A, there's something going on deeper with them, or B, there's something going on between us, or C, there's something going on with myself. Yeah.
And I have a perfect example. On Instagram one time, we posted a picture and this dude just snapped in the comments, right? Like, this is the worst hoodie I've ever got. Like,
I remember
X, Y, and Z just going off. And I was like, man, like,
what happened?
Yeah, I was like, I'm sorry.
Like dead bugs in your hoodie?
Yeah, I'm just like going off. Like, this itches and X, Y, and Z. And, you know, I had some things typed out originally.
Oh, I remember this. I'm pretty sure you called me and you're like, dude, I'm
about to snap.
Yeah.
And I ended up not sending those, and I DM'd the guy, and I was like, hey, man, like, I'm sorry. Like, we will give you all your money back, X, Y, and Z. I don't know, you know, what the issue is. I'm not really asking questions. You know, here's your money back, and I apologize for whatever happened. And he sent back this long thing of, you know what, man, like, no, the hoodie's fine. Like, I had some other stuff going on in my life, and I chose to take it out on y'all, and that was wrong, and X, Y, and Z, whatever. And it ended up being a good conversation with this dude, and got to talk to him for a little bit. But there was, you know, him lashing out originally, and then me having the opportunity to lash back instantly, but to have kind of some grace. And I like our hoodies, so I didn't really take it, you know, worth a grain of salt. But to get back to the point is, everyone's kind of going through something, and you don't know exactly. So when these lash outs happen, it's, again, trying to show them some grace and some gentleness, and kind of going back to the ultimate question is, what would Jesus do in this situation?
Yeah,
right?
It's a spiritual opportunity, right? Like, maybe that's an opportunity that God's calling you to be full of grace and to be forgiving, and to maybe even help them understand that, hey, like,
it's all good.
It's all good, brother. Yeah. Like, we can figure this thing out, and you had a bad day, I'll take it with a grain of salt, but let this be a learning point for you that that's not the right way to act, right? And I think that does take some maturity, because like Macen pointed out earlier, like we can't agree to disagree anymore. Like it's my side or that side. And I feel like that's an issue, and a lot of that comes from the false self and what we actually truly believe in and what we're showing to others.
Yeah, it's tough to, and kudos to that guy. For at
owning
least
up to it.
At least owning up and saying, "Hey, like I was having a bad day," because that's him also taking an opportunity to go and apologizing. And I think he went and deleted the comment or whatever. Which,
he like went and took the comment off, and like I think he might have even leaving a good one like after that or something.
So it's like people are going through all sorts of different stuff. Now, I had said something earlier, and I was kind of setting our viewers' brain to talk about this. So I had talked about people who are set in their ways. Did you guys find interesting what he talked about the difference between the elderly and an elder? Okay, so I'm going to read some.
I'm nodding my head.
Okay. Yeah, for those of you not watching.
Yeah, me too.
So it's a little paragraph. It says, this is page 38. It says, one of the saddest statements I ever hear about the human experience is when someone says of an older man, "Oh, he's just set in his ways." What this means is that he has perfected the self-life. He has cultivated an elaborate and sophisticated manner to make his life work apart from God and to avoid the pain. He has become static. It is what sets apart the elderly, someone who's grown old in the maturing of his false self, from an elder, someone who has matured in his true self and is an ever-growing union with God. That is very interesting and powerful at the same time.
Yeah, and it's funny because this next part kind of goes along with what you were saying, and it's in he's talking about basically that life gives way to death, so that death can give way to a greater life. Like we believe that after we by believing in the Son and living the life that we're supposed to, that when we pass away, that we will have eternal life in heaven. And the biblical analogy is, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. And that goes back to, if you're going to tear down, if you want to build a greater city, you got to tear something down in order to build something up. And I feel like that part of us that needs to, go away, part of our internal soul that needs to be killed, and so more fruitful things can be brought to life. Like that is an example. And even too, when we talk about, there's somewhere, in the Bible where you have to prune the vines and branches and stuff like that, so it gives more opportunity for other things to grow. It's the same thing. There's parts of us that we need to prune, and take away in order for other things to blossom and flourish in our lives. And that's what we're trying to do on this podcast. That's what we're here for. We're help leading y'all in that same journey to do the same things. And I feel like that this is the perfect book to guide that, and this is definitely reshaping, my relationship with Mallory, my relationship with y'all. It's a challenge. It really is, each and every day. But it's definitely the right one. Yeah.
Right. Like, and changing that relationship with yourself and the awareness and the self-talk. I think that's been big for me as well.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I think awareness is a big part of it. And that's the last thing he kind of addresses.
I guess I can kind of go back to like that little exercise I talked about, right? Mm-hmm. It's like being aware of your best self, but also that false self.
Yeah. And so he says, who am I in my false self? What version of myself do I present to the world as a mask to self-protect? What is my effect on people? What do people feel when they are around me? Mm-hmm. And that's very powerful, because we talk about this all the time. The littlest thing you may do, or the littlest thing you don't do, may have a huge impact on somebody's day.
Yeah, you never know.
Whether it's holding the door, calling your mom, whatever it is, you are going to have a huge impact on that person's day. Mm-hmm. And
I like how he alludes to, like, we are meant as men and as humans to be reborn into this new life, a true life in which Jesus is the center of it. And it says the pain and loss of the false self and its death is not, it's obviously going to be a painful process, but it's meant to compel us to lean into the vibrant and accessible life of Jesus, the abundance of the Father's heart, and the leadership of the Holy Spirit. And this is what allows us to become who we were meant to be. But in order for that to happen, your false self has to essentially die and go away. And for anybody that is struggling with that portion, I would say, and like we said, this is why I'm so glad we're doing this as a community, us three together, is because we can, abide in one another, and challenge each other to abide in God's heart. Because, and if you're not doing it, just know that there is confidence in this search and journey with the Creator, right? Like, this doesn't have to be done in a community. I know it helps us be more accountable to one another, but this can be done with you looking in the mirror and you journaling things down to challenge yourself and become a better person. Because at the end of the day, this is for you. This is for you to grow and be the best person that God has created you to be, so that the lives of everyone around you can be truly changed.
Yeah, and I don't know if you got a final thought.
He snapped. I was gonna let it ride.
Good stuff right there. And so I just want to, his last little sentences here. He says, "You'll want to get to know the false self and get very familiar with him. Because in order for you to change who you are and to become your more true version of yourself and your true self, you have to know when you are being your false self."
Mm-hmm.
So
keep your friends close, your enemies closer, and kind of goes along the same lines. It's like you need to fully understand that person so that you know how to tear that person down and become and allow more of your true self in.
Yeah. So we thank you guys again for listening to this episode. We will have more episodes coming your way. Feel free to check us out on not only social media, but YouTube as well, which I guess is a form of social media. So appreciate y'all.
Audio, podcast, video, YouTube.
You name it.
Gang.
We got it.
Yeah.
You're
Appreciate it.